Maysin had always been drawn to the macabre, and his fascination with the darker aspects of life had led him to settle near Gravesend Cemetery. The cemetery, with its ancient, crumbling tombstones and thick, gnarled trees, had a certain melancholic beauty that appealed to his dark sensibilities. It was no surprise to those who knew him that he had chosen this place to call home. Lately, however, Gravesend had become more than just a picturesque setting for Maysin. It had become a place of nightmares. The town of Gravesend had been plagued by a series of gruesome attacks, and the whispers of ghouls roaming the cemetery at night had grown louder and more insistent. Maysin, with his background in survival and weapons training, couldn't ignore the terror that had gripped his town. He knew he had to act. One misty evening, armed with nothing but a silver axe, Maysin made his way to the cemetery. The fog swirled around the graves, creating ghostly shapes in the dim light of the moon. The air was thick with an unnatural chill, and Maysin felt the weight of the task ahead pressing down on him. He was determined, though. The ghouls had to be stopped. As he approached the cemetery gates, Maysin tightened his grip on the silver axe. He had chosen this weapon carefully. Silver was known to be effective against supernatural creatures, and he needed every advantage he could get. His heart pounded in his chest as he pushed open the gate and stepped inside. The cemetery was eerily quiet. The only sounds were the crunch of gravel beneath Maysin's boots and the distant hoot of an owl. He made his way through the maze of tombstones, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. The fog made it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead, but Maysin pressed on, his senses alert. He had walked for several minutes when he heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from somewhere ahead. Maysin froze, his heart racing. He raised the axe, ready for whatever was about to come at him. The growl grew louder, and then he saw them. A group of ghouls, their pale, withered faces contorted in grotesque grimaces, emerging from the fog. There were at least 20 of them, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Maysin's blood ran cold, but he steeled himself. He had faced danger before, and he knew he had to stay focused if he was going to survive this night. The first ghoul lunged at him, its bony fingers grasping for his throat. Maysin swung the axe with all his might, the blade slicing through the ghoul's neck with a sickening crunch. The creature's head toppled to the ground, its body crumpling in a heap. But there was no time to celebrate. The other ghouls were closing in. Maysin fought with a ferocity he didn't know he possessed. He swung the axe again and again, each strike sending another ghoul to the ground. The cemetery was filled with the sounds of battle, the growls and screeches of the ghouls, the thud of bodies hitting the ground, and the clang of the axe as it struck bone. The ghouls were relentless, but Maysin was determined. He moved with precision and skill, his training taking over as he fought for his life. The ghouls were strong, but they were not invincible. One by one, they fell to Maysin's silver axe. Hours passed, though it felt like an eternity. Maysin was exhausted, his muscles screaming in protest with every swing of the axe. His clothes were torn and bloodied, and he was covered in cuts and bruises. But he couldn't stop. He had to keep fighting. Finally, as the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, Maysin faced the last ghoul. This one was larger and more menacing than the others, its eyes burning with a malevolent fire. It let out a deafening roar and charged at him, its claws outstretched. Maysin braced himself and swung the axe with all the strength he had left. The blade connected with the ghoul's chest, cutting deep. The creature let out a final, agonized scream and collapsed at his feet. Breathing heavily, Maysin looked around at the carnage. The ground was littered with the bodies of the ghouls he had slain. He had done it. He had defeated them all. As the sun rose higher, casting long shadows over the cemetery, Maysin staggered out of Gravesend Cemetery. His body ached from the battle, and every step was a painful reminder of the night's events. He glanced back at the tombstones, now bathed in the soft morning light, and felt a surge of grim satisfaction. The ghouls were no more. The town of Gravesend had been terrorized for weeks, but now, thanks to Maysin's bravery, the nightmare was over. He knew it would take time for the town to recover from the trauma. But at least they could begin to rebuild their lives without the constant fear of the ghouls. As he made his way home, Maysin couldn't shake the feeling that he had only scratched the surface of the horrors that lurked in the darkness. The ghouls had been a formidable enemy, but they were not the only threat. He had to stay vigilant. Days turned into weeks, and the town slowly began to return to a semblance of normalcy. Maysin's heroics had earned him a reputation as a fearless protector, and the townspeople looked to him for guidance and reassurance. But Maysin knew that his work was far from over. One evening, as he sat by the fire in his small cottage, Maysin heard a knock at the door. He opened it to find a young woman standing on his doorstep, her eyes wide with fear. "Please," she said, her voice trembling, "I need your help. My brother went missing near the old church. People say there are still creatures out there." Maysin's heart sank. He had hoped that the ghouls were the only threat, but it seemed there were still dangers lurking in the shadows. He grabbed his silver axe and followed the woman into the night. As they made their way to the old church, Maysin felt the familiar chill in the air. The fog was thick, and the moon cast an eerie glow over the landscape. He tightened his grip on the axe, ready for whatever awaited them. When they reached the church, Maysin could see the fear in the woman's eyes. He assured her that he would find her brother and bring him back safely. With a determined nod, he pushed open the creaking door and stepped inside. The church was dark and silent, the air heavy with the scent of decay. Maysin moved cautiously, his senses alert. He had faced ghouls before, and he knew that they could be anywhere, waiting to strike. As he ventured deeper into the church, he heard a faint, muffled cry. It was coming from the basement. Maysin descended the stairs, his heart pounding. When he reached the bottom, he saw a young man, bound and gagged, lying on the cold stone floor. Maysin rushed to the man's side and freed him from his restraints. The young man was weak and frightened, but he managed to whisper, "They're coming." Before Maysin could react, he heard the sound of shuffling footsteps behind him. He turned to see a group of ghouls emerging from the shadows, their eyes glowing with malevolent light. There were more of them than he had faced before, and they looked even more menacing in the confined space of the basement. With a roar, Maysin charged at the ghouls, his silver axe gleaming in the dim light. He fought with everything he had, his muscles screaming in protest with every swing. The ghouls were relentless, but Maysin's determination was stronger. The battle was fierce, and the basement was soon filled with the sounds of clashing metal and the growls of the ghouls. Maysin fought with a ferocity born of desperation, knowing that he had to protect the young man and the town. As the last ghoul fell, Maysin stood victorious, his body battered and bruised. He helped the young man to his feet and led him back to the waiting woman. She embraced her brother, tears of relief streaming down her face. "Thank you," she said to Maysin, her voice filled with gratitude. "You saved him." Maysin nodded, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the battle was far from over. He knew that there were more creatures out there, waiting for their chance to strike. But he also knew that he would be ready. He would protect the town of Gravesend, no matter what.